Hi, I'm Gareth Green and welcome to another in our little series of Inside the Mind of Bach videos, in which we're looking at some of the chorale harmonizations made by Bach just to see what he does with the harmony, how he decorates the harmony, which keys he uses, how he modulates, to get some kind of insight both into the Bach style and also into good practice when it comes to writing four-part harmony. So these are wonderful models to look at if you're wanting to develop your skills in the writing of harmony. Well, we're having a look at quite a famous chorale in this video, and you'll find that Bach has done a number of different harmonizations of the same chorale. But here's one of them. And let me just play it to you first so we've got the sound of it in our minds before we explore it. So the first two phrases of a chorale setting that's often known in English as "O Sacred Head, Sore Wounded." Okay, let's see what's going on. We've got these pause signs marking the end of phrases, not meant to be treated as pauses particularly, but just Bach's way of marking the end of a phrase. So the first phrase here is in the key of D major. We can be absolutely sure about that because we've got two sharps in the key signature. There's not another accidental in sight during that first phrase. The first phrase starts on a tonic chord of D major. It finishes on a tonic chord of D major. So it's very clearly in D major. There are some Bach chorale phrases you look at and you wonder what's going on with keys until you've unpacked it. This one, dead straightforward. The second phrase, very clearly in the relative minor key of B minor. And you notice it moves straight away after that first phrase, the chord after the pause sign. We've got an A sharp in the tenor part. That's pulling us straight into B minor. And then we have a cadence in B minor at the end. So this is a very clear example of what the keys are, where they change without any ambiguity of anything else going on. Well, let's begin to unpack what is happening here. In many ways, it's one of the simpler settings, but nevertheless, it has quite a number of intriguing details. So it starts on the last beat of a bar, and we're starting with chord 1 in D major. We move on to the first complete bar with a chord 4. Then we have a chord 1B. Now, one thing we're expecting to see in many Bach chorales is passing notes, suspensions, all sorts of decoration. But sometimes life is just plain and simple. And that's exactly how this one starts. And it kind of sets a mood for this particular chorale to have the simplicity of going 1, 4, and 1B. And you'll notice as well on that chord 4 that the tenor and the bass lines are just sharing a note. It's not something that happens that often, but it can happen. So it's always an option when you're working through a harmonization and you're thinking, well, what shall I do with the parts here? You might have written something like this, and you might have started by taking the bass down to a G, and then you thought, oh, if I want to go up to F sharp, I'm going to get a big leap in the bass that I don't want. So it makes more sense to take the bass up. Bach might not have written a B in the tenor, because he could have put a B on that chord, couldn't he? But by so doing, he'd have created a double major third, something he quite often does actually, but it's something the textbooks encourage us to avoid because doubling a major third tends to make that major third dominate the chord a bit. So he's keeping it simple. He hasn't doubled the major third, but just shared that note. So it's always an option to bear in mind. So 1, 4, back to 1B. But notice he doesn't just come back to 1, he comes back to 1B. So it doesn't sound like we've started on 1, we've gone to 4, and then we've come back to 1. There's some movement by going 1 to 4 to 1B. So interesting example of, well, when do we use an inversion chord, when do we not? Just that notion of avoiding, starting here, going somewhere, coming back to where we started. The inversion takes us away, distracts us a little bit from that. After that 1B chord, well, suddenly things move on a bit, don't they? And we look at the third beat and we see that we've got moving parts, alto, tenor and bass. So we're immediately thinking, is there a passing note or what's going on here? Well, it's quite interesting what he does actually, because when we just look at the end of this bar, we've got this. So let's look at the third beat. On the third beat, we've got chord 4B, interestingly with a double major third, tenor and bass. So there's 4B, and it moves to another chord on the second half of that beat. So it's a 5-7B. So quite fast harmonic rhythm all of a sudden. You know, normally we wouldn't be changing chords quite so quickly, but sometimes that happens. So we've had a chord on each beat for the first 3 chords, and then now we've got 2 chords inside a beat. So it's quite fast, isn't it? So 4B to 5-7B. Now, what's all that about? It's giving us a bit of harmonic movement, a bit of a shot in the back after that simple start. The alto is also preparing for a suspension, because you see in the alto we've got D, E. The E is preparing for this. E on the next beat. You can hear that is dissonant, isn't it? And it's a 9-8. So he's preparing at the end of beat 3, sounding at the beginning of beat 4, resolving in the second half of beat 4. So remember, you prepare, sound, resolve with a suspension. The prepare note has to belong to its prevailing chord, which it does because it belongs to that 5-7B. And the resolution has to belong to its chord, that D at the end of the bar there, belongs to the chord 1. The suspension note is the dissonant note, that's that E at the beginning of beat 4. You can hear the dissonance there. And the note that you're using to prepare and sound should be the same as each other. And then when you resolve from the suspended note, you're trying to move by step, nearly always downwards. That's exactly what happens here. So we've got a 4B chord going to a 5-7B that's preparing the alto for a 9-8 suspension. And it's called 9-8 because it's going 9 to 8 above the bass note. D in the bass, 9-8. So that's what's going on there. Then we come to a cadence using a very standard Bach procedure where he goes 2-7B, 5, 1. And you'll find so many cadences in Bach chorales that do that. 2-7B, 5, 1. That's exactly what goes on here. So there it is, 2-7B, 5, 1. Okay, now we've arrived on that D major chord, and now we're going to start the second phrase. And Bach, as I said earlier, goes straight into B minor. Now, some people might be looking at this saying, well, hang on a minute, where's the pivot chord? The pivot chord is the chord that we use to move from one key to the next. So it's a chord that's common to the key you're leaving and to the key you're joining. So normally that happens, and you see pivot chords all over Bach chorales. Sometimes he just moves into a new key without particularly using a pivot chord. If he does that, he often does it on the first chord of a new phrase. And quite often it's some kind of 5-1 movement. It's quite a strong movement into the new key. So you see that D major chord is not really a chord in B minor. You could say it's a sort of chord 3, but really chord 3 should have an A sharp in it Could have an A natural in it if you're using chord 3 in relation to a descending melodic minor. So it could be seen as a kind of pivot chord, but it's certainly not a very obvious one. But you might just think, well, no, really, it feels like 2, 7B, 5, 1 in D major, and then he just plunges into B minor with these two chords. And it works perfectly well. And it's actually quite effective because it gives you another sort of shot in the back, doesn't it? At the beginning of a new phrase. So you see what he's doing there. What is this chord that starts the second phrase? Well, this is a 7B in B minor. So lots of people are nervous about using chord 7. I can understand why, because chord 7 is a diminished chord, whether you're in a minor key or a major key, so it's a tricky one to deal with. But if you use it in first inversion, it tends to work a treat. It's perfectly okay to use it in second inversion as well sometimes, but first inversion is the safest place to use it. So you see what he's got there, that 7B going to 1. And you see as well, we've got this sort of contramotion running between the outer parts, which helps keep the harmony running smoothly and helps you to avoid consecutives. So there's your 7B going to 1. Okay, now we've got a bit more quaver movement going. You notice this next bar, something is happening on every half beat. So 1 in B minor, double unaccented passing notes in the alto and the bass. So you see how you've got double running in parallel. When they run in parallel like that, they tend to be thirds or sixths. So these are thirds, compound thirds. Unaccented because they're coming between beats there. That takes us on to chord 1B, another unaccented passing note in the bass. So he's going 1, 1, but we don't want just to go 1, 1. So he's using the inversion trick again, 1 to 1B. So 1, 1B, passing note. Now then, what's all this about? Something interesting going on there, isn't there? Because we've got a little bit of dissonance. You notice that C sharp is dissonant with this B. So there's something going on there. And then it comes down onto there, doesn't it? And you think, well, what is that all that about, really? It's a funny one, isn't it? Well, it's a sort of bit of a combination of things going on. Because in the soprano, he's turning that C sharp into an accented passing note from the previous chord. We're accenting that passing note onto the B that belongs to the chord there. And we've got from there, we're going to a chord 5. With a passing note in the alto that turns it into a 5/7, and then it all resolves into a chord 1 of B minor. So that's how this particular chorale works, and I hope that makes reasonable sense to you. You might be thinking in that penultimate bar on bar 3, there's something a bit funny about that, because where is the third of that chord? It's a B minor chord. Sounds a bit bald, doesn't it? There's no D. You think he'd be trying to get a D in there somewhere. So it's quite an intriguing chord. Normally you would be thinking we ought to have a third in a chord, but he seems to get away without one there. So one of the interesting things about these Bach chorales is you see kind of all the standard things that you want to know about. You see some clever ways of getting around a few corners. And then occasionally you see something and you think, oh, that's a bit unusual. But there it is, a B minor chord with no third in it. But quickly moving on to that 5, taking us into the final cadence. You might also look at that final chord and say, I wonder why he's got a triple root in the last chord. You know, B, 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 3 parts. That's something we try to avoid. And he could easily have allowed that A sharp in the tenor to fall to an F sharp in the final chord. Well, it becomes a 5/7 at the end of the previous bar. And so we know that the 7th from a 5/7 normally resolves downwards by step. The 3rd, that will be the A sharp, normally pulls up. But if that 3rd coming up is the note that creates a triple root in the next chord, it can fall to the fifth of the next chord. So we could easily have allowed the A sharp in the tenor to fall to F sharp on that final chord. Well, he chose not to. We know not why, but it might have filled out the chord a bit more to have gone to an F sharp. Sometimes you look at these things and you think, well, why not fall to an F sharp? And then you look at the next phrase and think, oh no, that's going to create consecutive fifths or something, so I won't do that. So sometimes there's good reason for it. But it's always good to kind of tune into the possibilities. So I hope that makes sense of what's happening in these first two phrases. So having said all that, let's have a listen again to these first two phrases and see if we can hear all of that in action. There's a kind of simplicity about that chorale, isn't there? But it's also very beautiful, very moving. So I hope you've enjoyed studying those two phrases of the chorale and that it helps empower your own writing of four-part harmony and appreciation of it. And if you want to know a bit more about the Bach chorale style, well, have a look at the Music Matters website where we have a course on writing chorale harmonizations in the Bach style, just to go a little bit further, a bit deeper with your study with all of this. And if you're into music and you would like the opportunity to be part of a group that meets monthly on a live stream, have a look at joining our Maestros program, because that is exactly what we do. There are lots of perks in being a maestro, but one of them is to meet monthly on a live stream. So if that's something you fancy, again, have a look on the website on the homepage, click on Maestros, it will tell you all about it. But enjoy your Bach chorales and your four-part harmony.